Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, this week's Parsha is Parashat Noach. And friends, this Parsha is the first Parsha so far that the Almighty demonstrates himself as holy to humanity. In other words, after just learning in the previous Parsha that Hashem's creation and love for man was the pinnacle and the purpose of it all, here he makes himself ethically and morally relevant to his creation, informing the reader that in itself, love cannot exist without standards. And friends, I understand that nowadays one of the biggest disconnects that occurs when trying to understand and embody the principles laid out here in the beginning of Torah is really due to how far we've come theologically. The notion that how could this prehistoric narrative teach me anything about morality? I mean, I went to college, I learned that I could acquire ethical excellence by just living a humanistic lifestyle. However, friends, what they fail to notice is that the only reason they could speak as they do is only because, whether they want to admit it or not, they are standing on the shoulders of giants. In other words, it was Torah itself that got their ball rolling. And this is how. Because, friends, it's no secret that virtually every great humanist in the Western world came from a family or a past with biblical roots. And honestly, all you really have to do is open up a history book and take a look at societies that either did not have the Torah standard, or in cases like the Soviet Union, tossed it out completely. And what? And followed their trail of carnage. And in cases where movements like atheistical humanism and other religions like Christianity and Islam, that they may seem at their outset moral and ethical, it's really only because, whether they're conscious of it or not, they have made Torah their foundation. However, because they have intertwined Torah with their new beliefs and their flawed philosophies, they will eventually fail. Why? Because that flawed philosophy will eventually catch up with them. In other words, friends, any movement that does not have Torah, and not just in their theology, but in what defines their goal, which is ultimately the goal of making the world a better place, my friends, it is doomed to fail. And friends, another reason many people have chosen not to learn from this Torah is because most people, especially nowadays, have stopped thinking in the collective. In other words, if the topic or even the prophecy does not deal with them personally or in their near future, they don't want to hear about it. Which is really why movements like Christianity, Islam, and even Kabbalistic Judaism arose in the first place, to emotionally cater to the individual and even the generation. Which not only gets us missing the big picture, but also gets us repeating the same mistakes we've made as a people in the past. And friends, this is a notion that really resonates in this Parsha. In how in last week's Parsha, through Adam's sin, we saw the future redemption of man. And in this week's Parsha, through the world's sin, through their fall, we are giving a glimpse of humanity's future redemption. On how both descents were the cause of a word that most Jews do not like to use much nowadays. And that's the word sin. On how the final redemption will be the result of a world wanting to emulate the Creator in his purest form, or whatever avenue or standard he has revealed to us presently. Because back then it was the 7 laws. Actually, by that time it was the 6 laws, till the 7th law was given to Noah. And today, my friends, it's a 613 mitzvot, which is nothing less than the Almighty's will in an instructional form. And friends, another area where this Parsha hits home is how those generations before the flood strayed from Hashem. Actually, the Rambam explains it perfectly in Hilchot Avodah Zorah on what was the root of their idolatry and what ultimately led to their immoral behavior. He writes that during the times of Enosh, mankind made a great mistake, and the wise men of that generation gave thoughtless counsel. Enosh himself was one of those who erred. Their mistake was as follows. They said that God created stars and spheres with which to control the world. He placed them on high and treated them with honor, making them servants who minister before him. Accordingly, it is fitting to praise and glorify them and treat them with honor. They perceive this by the will of God. Blessed be he that they magnified and honored those whom he magnified and honored, just as a king desires that the servants who stand before him be honored. Indeed, doing so in an expression of honor to the king, However, after conceiving of this notion, they began to construct temples to the stars and offer sacrifices to them. They would praise and glorify them with words and prostrate before them, because by doing so they would, according to their false conception, be fulfilling the will of God. This was the essence of the worship of false gods, and this was the rationale of those who worship them. They would not say that there is no other God except for the star. And friends, I'm sorry to say that this is what's happening in the religious Jewish world today, on how regarding rabbis, respect has turned into glorification, and glorification has ultimately turned into worship. And similar to the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood, we have emulated their behavior and not our Creator. And my friends, this is something that is evident within the religious Jewish world today, in how before a religious Jew does or said something, he asks, what would this or that rabbi do or say, and not what our Creator may have said or done in Torah, so he can emulate it. And friends, I know it's not easy to hear, but you know what? We can't deal with the problem without first asking how it started, like I just explained in Hilchot Avodah Zorah. And friends, this is the main reason this parsha is so relevant today. Why? Because when humanity begins to go astray, idolatry is always at the root of the issue. The problem is that nowadays when someone hears the word Avodah Zorah, they picture statues and temples and blood sacrifices. Nonsense. Avodah Zorah in biblical terms is anything that gets you to emulate anything but the Creator, whether it's men or stars that have been elevated to a supreme godly status, or even in today's terms, modern day irreligious trends. Truly what the word means, foreign worship. And then, friends, we see another principle brought down in the Parsha. The notion that, you know what, sometimes some people you can't fix. That sometimes the only option is to destroy and start again. And friends, this is what we see the Creator do. However, we see that after he destroys almost all of humanity, we see the Creator himself remind the reader on the sanctity of human life, lest we begin to lessen the worth of man because of the narrative. It states, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. Now note that this was said at the time when there was no Jewish people. In other words, friends, it's telling us that all humanity is equally intrinsically valuable, bringing down yet another principle, that man in himself is not wicked or righteous, but rather it's the decisions we make that decide our outcome. Which is why, friends, wasting no time, the Almighty gives us a glimpse of his final standard to come by mentioning Avram, almost in a systematic, ethical fashion, almost stating that if humanity can repair itself with only 7 laws, I'll give them my whole ethical will in an instructional form to help them do so. I'll give them the Torah. Because, my friends, this is what the Almighty had in mind all along, for the world to be willing enough to keep his instructions, his complete instructions. Because, my friends, unlike many rabbis describe it nowadays, the world is not separated between Jew and non-Jew, but rather only between the decent and the indecent. And I'm sorry to say that the keys of decency is not contained anywhere else than the 613 mitzvot, and anyone who buys into any other standard is just wasting his or her time. And then, friends, the Parsha goes on to speak about Bavel, teaching us that unity is not always a good or positive pursuit, which is actually the battle cry heard most from the religious Jewish community today. Achdut, Achdut. And this, friends, is one of the things that you should never forget, that whenever you hear the word Achdut or unity, you must always ask, on whose terms? Because we could all just as well be moving collectively to destruction in a unified manner. In other words, friends, if you're hearing me today and you're also seeking for divine direction, I want to welcome you to embrace the 613 mitzvot through a kosher Torah conversion. For more information on converting to Judaism, please visit doordea.com, and don't give up. Keep Torah. Thank you.